Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Institute of Politics event. My name is Alina, and I'm a third-year pre-medical and public policy student. I'm a highly engaged student here at the IOP. I serve on the Student Advisory Board, and I'm chair of our LGBTQ+ student group Spectrum. I also sit on the Student Health Advisory Board at UChicago Student Wellness, and across these roles, I spend a lot of time thinking about student trust, health equity, and what it means to build health systems that truly serve all students, which makes tonight's event especially meaningful to me. Today's event is titled Bridging Innovation and Trust, and it is an honor to introduce Dr. Susan Monarez tonight. Dr. Monarez is a globally recognized leader with over 20 years of experience in health innovation. Dr. Monarez most recently served as the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, following an early term as acting director. Before her leadership at the CDC, she served as the deputy director of the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. In 2025, she led the CDC through significant organizational shifts, and her ultimate departure made national headlines. Her testimony before Congress emphasized the importance of scientific integrity, a theme at the heart of tonight's discussion on trust, misinformation, and the future of public health leadership. We're joined tonight by our moderator, Dr. Sandeep Jauhar, cardiologist, New York Times contributing writer, and best-selling author of multiple works, including Doctored, The Disillusionment of an American Physician. His work explores the human side of medicine, making him a perfect guide for tonight's conversation. Before we begin, please silence your phones. A microphone will be placed in the audience for Q&A, and students will receive priority for questions. Also for students, Dr. Monarez will lead a seminar titled Securing the Future of Global Health, Lessons from Leadership in Crisis Innovation, at 12:30 p.m. tomorrow at the Institute of Politics. Keep an eye out for winter speaker series and more at politics.uchicago.edu. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Monarez and Dr. Sandeep Jauhar.
Kudos to whoever chose that music.
Clever, very clever.
So, good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation with Dr. Susan Monarez. Some of you may know of Dr. Monarez from her long career in public health and public service, most recently as the director of the CDC. You may see her, as many of us do, as a hero to the cause of science, public health, and really truth and objectivity in this country. Last March, she was nominated by President Trump to lead the CDC and was confirmed by the Senate at the end of July. And what followed was perhaps the most eventful month in the 80-year history of the CDC, which included a shooting by a gunman at the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, in which a police officer was killed, and Dr. Monarez's removal from her position as director at the end of August, after only 29 days on the job. We're going to get into some of that and the lessons that we can draw. We'll also be talking about issues that affect all of us, including trust in science and public institutions, as well as the changing landscape of American medicine. This is meant to be a candid conversation, and I'm so grateful to Dr. Monarez for agreeing to join me up here. After the conversation, we'll take questions from you in the audience. So, Susan.
Yes.
Before we get into weightier topics, let me start with you.
Okay.
So, you grew up in rural Wisconsin. Your father was a dairy farmer. He lost the farm and eventually became a police officer.
Yep.
And your mother was a librarian.
Yes.
So you grew up in, let's say, modest means.
Yes, you could say that.
And yet, despite that, you went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison and eventually earned a PhD in immunology. And you went to Stanford and did a postdoc. So you could have had a great career in science, and yet you chose public service. Why?
Well, first, thank you for agreeing to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. I appreciate everything that you've been doing, all your writings, and just your consummate professionalism in all things health. And I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I know there's lots of activities here in Chicago, and so I appreciate you spending some time with us tonight. It's such a good question. So when I was at Stanford, I was really excited about the opportunities for health and innovation and health technology, and I was doing some really fascinating work. I won't get into the deep technical details, but it was really pioneering, looking at how to be able to diagnose individuals in austere environments, low middle income countries, pretty difficult areas, to make sure that we have adequate health care provision to people who need it and who are often left behind. That sense of service and contribution is one that I grew up with. It is one that I retained throughout my time in academia at the University of Wisconsin and at Stanford. And it's one that I kept with me, even when I was in a position I could have stayed in science and gone on the tenure track, although at the time the NIH pay line was pretty challenging, and I was working in unestablished fields. I was not, some of the grants that I had applied for, there was no one else publishing in that area, and so it was innovative, technically feasible, but not fundable. So there was already a little bit of a challenge there. But I could have gone and stayed in the private sector like so many of my peers did. And they went into the biotech revolution that was taking place in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area. But I was drawn to service. I've always been drawn to service. It's just part of, how I was raised and who I am. And when I was thinking about what comes next, I sort of had two tracks. One, I actually was very interesting. This is the first time I'm talking about this publicly. I had applied for two things simultaneously. I had applied for the Peace Corps, and I applied for a AAAS fellowship. And at the same time, the Peace Corps, I wanted to go and work in environments where I had been doing technical scientific research to help advance health in largely sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Central and South America, and wanted to continue in that regard. Or a AAAS fellowship, for those of you who aren't familiar, is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and it takes scientists and puts them into federal government and policy positions. And it just happened that the AAAS fellowship came through first. And so the Peace Corps process was taking longer. And so I took the AAAS fellowship and I joined the federal government. And it was an opportunity to continue to shape and to serve and to make sure that as I was now in a position of very sort of senior and influential positions, almost from the get-go, that I was attuned to how to deliver value and how to continue to serve in the public capacity. And so it just was something that it was never a question for me. It was never a doubt that I was going to continue in service. It was just a function of when and in what capacity.
I mean, the list of agencies, the number of acronyms, I am absolutely shocked. I mean, you worked at BARDA, ARPA-H,
Yep.
OSTP,
Yep.
HRSA,
Yes.
and then the CDC.
Yes. Oh, yeah, and there's a few others in there. I worked at HSARPA too, which is different than HRSA, but yes.
Yeah. So that's incredible. Let me just ask you, what advice would you give students here today who are at the stage you once were, trying to make a choice between private sector work, government work? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, I love that, and I wish somebody would have asked me that, I think, at this time. No one asked, I sort of plotted my own course. The advice that I would give anyone who is curious about, this course that I've taken is think about the greatest good you can have with the limited period of time that you have to be able to effectuate that. And having a meaningful depth of skill sets. So I happen to have scientific, technical skill sets that I applied much more broadly into policy, is knowing, having some anchoring deep technical expertise. It doesn't have to be immunology, it doesn't have to be infectious disease, it's something. And then thinking about a staged way to make those contributions. So even if you're drawn to the private sector, either out of undergraduate or graduate school, yes, do that. But if there is an opportunity to go into service of some kind, whether it is state and local service, whether it is national level service, give it a try. Spend some time giving back, really thinking about what it's like to try to create and shape policies that are in service of others, most of whom you will never see, but you are having that level of an impact. And just give yourself permission to step out for 2 to 3 to 5 years and make that level of contribution, make that level of service, and then go back to doing whatever it was that you had wanted to do before or that you want to do after. And you gain so much from the time that you spend in public service, and then there's no shame in stepping back into the private sector, knowing that you've made that level of contribution. I think one of the challenges is that people don't know how to get into that level of service, and there's a number of different ways. And this, if I were a student, certainly reaching out to a counselor or somebody to say what are the avenues in which I can do, whether it's again at the state level or in my case at the federal level, and then just taking that leap. And you don't know where it's going to lead you. When I left California to move to Washington, I would have never imagined that I would be in the White House shaping national level policies to respond to the Ebola outbreak, to shape where we're going with all of this new health technology and patient privacy and security. I would have never guessed that, but I had the opportunity just weaving my way through the acronym soup to get all the way to the White House. You don't know where it's going to lead. And now I find myself going back into the private sector and exploring what that looks like, having known that I spent almost 20 years doing everything I could in public service. And so I really think that there's so much opportunity when you just sort of give yourself that flexibility and the opportunity to really to chase the whether it's public service and everything that leads, or in the private sector. The last thing I would just say is, if I were young, if I were back in my in the student seat, almost 30 years ago now, I would want to recognize that we have such a limited period of time to have such a profound impact. And so taking every opportunity to contribute to others in any capacity possible is really the most meaningful thing that I think that you can do with especially here at the University of Chicago, where you gain such incredible technical skills, in the course of matriculation through the academic environment, and being able to use those skills to contribute to the greater good. I think there's no higher calling for that than that.
Yeah, I think that's very profound. I'm a physician writer, and you know, when I wanted to get into writing, you know, I decided to follow my dreams and take risks, and I think that's so important. I walked into the New York Times and asked them to let me write for them without any clips, without really any experience. And, you know, I just think to the students out there, it's just important to be a little stupid. You know, if I had known then what I know now, I never would have walked into the New York Times and said, hey, let me write for you. So, yeah, I think risk-taking, as you put it, is just so important. So moving ahead, you were appointed acting CDC Director by President Trump in January 2025. At the time, he called you, quote, a dedicated public servant, and he said that, quote, Americans have lost confidence in the CDC. He also said that the CDC would finally address the chronic disease epidemic and make America healthy again. So you stepped into this incredible role with so many challenges. I think we were talking earlier, there were 5 infectious disease outbreaks going on. Ebola, Marburg virus, TB, measles, I'm missing one.
H5.
And H5N1. What were your goals when you were appointed, and what, in your view, are the obstacles to the CDC acting decisively to cope with outbreaks?
Yeah, so I'll sort of break that down in a couple of ways. When I was asked to step in as the acting, it really was to stabilize an organization that was still a little unbalanced, just coming out of the COVID era. And then, of course, they had the 5 ongoing outbreaks at the time, and there was a lot of uncertainty about, you know, how would this organization be able to continue and advance, you know, as it transitioned through into the new administration. And the first thing, of course, I did is want to make sure that I understood what were the current goals and priorities and strengths and opportunities for innovation as they were understood by the organization, the staff, the leadership that was there. And so spending some time with the current career staff to really get a handle on, you know, how were they thinking about addressing these emergent infectious diseases. We had both strategic areas of consideration, but operational areas of consideration. And then more broadly across CDC, what were the other non-communicable disease activities that were ongoing? How were they being prioritized? What were they thought the strengths and the challenges were? And so really as an acting, it was just about trying to stabilize the organization and shepherd it through the transition period. And what I learned in that time is that there was a depth and breadth of technical sophistication that I had worked with the CDC, but I didn't fully understand just how incredible the organization was, how incredible the staff were, but also how much they wanted to modernize, how much they wanted to embrace technology and innovation. And I was coming out of one of the you know, most you know, newly established entities within the federal government, ARPA-H, this Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, which was one of the co-founders establishing that. And the staff were really excited to talk about how do you bring a moonshot over the horizon type innovation and implement it in a scalable and sustainable way in an organization, as you said, 80-year history, like one of the most storied organizations in the world. Quite often the first call from any Ministry of Health when they see something anomalous happening within infectious diseases within their countries. And so really that the few weeks that I was in an acting position, I got a boot camp in how to be professional under extraordinary duress with the infectious disease outbreaks, and then how to think about innovation and over-the-horizon thinking in the rest of the organization. And I came away with that with a lot of ideas for ultimately what I talked about during my Senate confirmation process, which were the priorities that I thought we would take into CDC and use to shape the organization at the time that I had the privilege of being at the helm. And that was to make sure that we improved public confidence in public health. And that's easy to say, and what we realize is it's so incredibly hard and challenging to be able to actually effectuate that. So sort of that was the first priority. And lots of ideas were coming out of the staff to be able to do that. The second one was, how do we modernize the public health infrastructure in CDC to help us do things faster, more technologically advanced, make decisions based on science evidence in a timely manner, so that we can make sure that we are preventing and mitigating and responding to any of the public health threats that we were faced with. And then, of course, one of the big challenges, which is to make sure that we're preparing for the next pandemic or emergent public health threat. And so, just in the time that I had spent as acting, I really had an opportunity to sort of formalize and flesh out the specific actions and goals that I wanted under each one of those pillars. And that was what I was excited about coming into the time when I was actually going to take the helm. It was an opportunity of great inspiration, but also humility to work with such extraordinary public health experts.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying about innovation is so important because, look, let's be honest, the CDC has been criticized for being slow to respond to outbreaks, and there's a certain organizational, slowness. The other big criticism is that, and I think that this runs into sort of why the public seems to lose trust in scientists, is that the CDC and its professionals who work there take evidence and they make recommendations, and then they change their recommendations based on new evidence.
Yep.
Too often it seems the public interprets that in a suspicious way.
Yeah.
Why did you change your recommendations? Yeah. Not understanding that it's just part of the scientific method to get to the truth. What do you think about that? How do we bridge those two perceptions?
Yeah, one of the goals that I had, that I just alluded to, exactly to your point, is to be as transparent and open as we possibly could regarding the work that we were doing across all facets of CDC. And I sort of would break it down into these three functions, talking about what we know, how we know it, and then making sure that we are able to communicate when we know it. And I think a lot, to your exact point, is CDC had been criticized for being slow, for being intransparent about some of the science and evidence it was using to drive decision making, to updating decisions or updating recommendations without, without the perception of traceability and without the effective communication to a broad audience. And again, what I will say is, in conversations with the technical experts at CDC, they fully recognize that. And what our goals were to be able to improve our transparency, our timeliness of communications, and when we were in those communications, to meet people where they were, not having someone need to have acquired a PhD in infectious diseases to understand a changing set of recommendations, or have a deep clinical background and being able to understand the technical depth of why a particular vaccine or therapeutic is now recommended for this or that kind of a distribution. really making sure that we could provide that science, that evidence in a very clear and effective way, but also to improving public trust. One of my goals was to get out of Atlanta and get out of Washington, D.C., and have an opportunity to meet people physically and regionally where they were, to be able to hear directly from individuals, whether they agreed with us or they didn't agree with us, and to be able to say, how can we better communicate what we're doing in a way that can allow you to understand the science and evidence that we're using for these decision-making. Ask us the questions you want to ask us. Ask us the hard questions about why are you doing this now? You did this in the past, and allowing us to get a better sense for what types of communications would be appropriate and necessary to restore broad-scale public trust. I do think that that is still something that is so significant and so important for what not only CDC needs to do, but public health more broadly, is it has to be able to meet people where they are, to understand what is being recommended, why it's being recommended, and what the benefit is to an individual, a community, or a population level. And there's a huge gap, and somebody needs to be able to start to fill in that gap and really effectuate a better communication approach for public health.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a problem of communicating scientific nuance.
That's right.
In a extremely politically polarized environment.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a real challenge. Yeah. So moving further ahead, you were nominated by President Trump to become the permanent director of the CDC in the spring. For the first time in history, that appointment required Senate confirmation. Mm-hmm. You were, of course, confirmed by the Senate, and you were sworn in on July 31st. About a week later, a gunman who apparently believed he had been harmed by mRNA vaccines shot 200 bullets at the CDC's main headquarters in Atlanta and killed a police officer. Yeah. This came only days after Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the head of the Health and Human Services, cut funding for mRNA vaccines. I'll let the audience draw their own conclusions about correlation or causation. But tell me about the days after the shooting. How did you cope? How did the professionals at the CDC deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, to really understand my mindset in that time, I have to take you back to the Monday of that week with the shooting. So that Monday was the first day that I was at CDC headquarters after having been confirmed as the director of CDC. And I spent that week looking my staff members in the eye at our main headquarters campus, and then we have another large campus down in Atlanta. I met with thousands of them. I met them in the cafeterias. I met them in the hallways. I met them in I did pop-ins in their staff meetings. I had the opportunity to meet so many people, literally thousands of individuals on the campuses who were so excited to finally have a confirmed CDC director. They would stand in lines for, half an hour or more just, for a chance to say hi. To a person, I would shake their hands, and I would ask them who they were, where they worked, what inspired them, and then how did they want to innovate. And they all had answers. They had personal, deep motivations for wanting to serve at the CDC, for wanting to contribute what they were contributing. They were all deeply inspired to do incredible work, and they wanted to continue to do so. And the last piece on how do you want to innovate, they all had an answer. They all had, we've been doing this this way for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and we think there's a better way. We think there's a better way. And that was so exhilarating. I am a people person, and I was so excited every time I met someone who they were levitating. Everyone was so energized to want to contribute something so great and so influential and impactful in public health. And I left there that Friday afternoon to go back. My kid's still in the Washington, D.C. area, so I got on a plane to fly back. And sometimes you get Wi-Fi, sometimes you don't. And on this plane, I didn't have Wi-Fi for most of the flight. And then when I finally did get Wi-Fi, and many of you may have had this experience, where all of a sudden all my texts started coming in. And I will tell you, as we were approaching National, and I was reading my texts from these incredible people that I had just spent a week with and had developed this incredible bond, knowing we were going to do amazing things together. The texts were saying, there's something happening here. We hear bullets, they're hitting our windows, and seeing images of bullet holes in the windows, and trying to understand, without being able to talk to anybody, what was happening at our flagship campus buildings. It was gut-wrenching, and I have never felt so angry and powerless and upset. And in my professional career, it was just one of those times where I just was like, I can't get off this plane. I need to do something. I can't get a hold of anybody. I was trying to text, things were intermittent. I got off the plane, and I was running through the airport. For those of you who've flown international, it's relatively small, thank goodness. I'm on the phone, I'm trying to get a hold of my deputy and others to schedule a meeting to try to get a hold of as many individuals as we can to figure out what has actually happened. And I finally get to the basement of the parking lot off National Airport, and we have our first meeting, and it is, we have as many of our senior leaders as possible on that call, and some were in tears, some were shaking, some were still in the facilities where they were on lockdown. Federal marshals were coming through the buildings. They were breaking down doors. They had to go door by door, and many of the doors are locked and swipe access only, because there were so many bullet holes that had hit the windows in the buildings that they had to go literally room by room by room looking for individuals and casualties, which at that time we still didn't know. I was on the phone and in calls to almost 2 a.m. that morning, and then again starting at 6 a.m. the next morning, trying to understand what had happened. And at first we had thought there were multiple individuals who had been shot, and it turns out that tragically, one officer had lost his life right in our driveway. But there was a daycare center there with children of our employees. It was just really, it was just such a devastating event. And the next 2 weeks were just a personal commitment to making sure that we were operationally still doing our mission for the outbreaks or for the critical activities that were happening with operations of CDC, trying to make sure that we had a thorough understanding of all the safety and security implications to know whether or not or when we would bring our staff back, but then remembering that these thousands and thousands of employees had just lived through something that was extraordinarily traumatic, and trying to make sure that I understood what I could do as their leader to to hear them, to understand what they were going through, and allow them and afford them the resources, the capabilities to heal. And it was just, anyone who's ever been in a position of having to lead an organization through that level of trauma, it is one of those of extraordinary humility and really just making sure that you are there every hour that someone needs you, every minute that someone needs you, to make sure that you're leading through that level of crisis. It was just, the last thing I'll say about this, unless you have any more questions, is I don't know that the American people understood the level of damage and devastation to our flagship campus and the goodness of the people that were on the other side of those windows and in those buildings. I know that the news cycle is fast and it moves on quickly, but this was a very, very important event in the history of our federal government. And it is one that I think upon reflection, we should really start to question and to understand and to you talked about the underlying motivation that was highlighted by the investigators, making sure that that type of an attack on our public health, infrastructure, on our public health people does not happen again. And that is also something that I think should be a priority as we're talking about restoring trust in public health.
I've known people, doctors, from medical school, from residency, who went and worked for the CDC. I know folks who went into the Epidemic Intelligence Service. They were some of the most committed, intelligent, socially conscious professionals I've ever known. And to think that they were targeted for doing their job to support public health, I mean, it's astounding.
It is, and so in the aftermath of the shooting, one of the things I did was to sit down with small groups of individuals who were on campus at the time of the shooting and hear their stories personally and hear what they thought we ought to be doing from their perspectives. In the course of those meetings, over several days, I met with hundreds of them. There were literally hundreds of individuals who were directly impacted by the shooting, that were in and around the daycare center trying to pick up their children, working behind the glass as the bullets were hitting it. And they had some very, very just challenging stories to hear. But I will say, to a person, they retained their commitment and their passion for public health, for service, and they all recognize the deep importance of how we got here, how that tragedy was motivated, and a commitment to restoring public trust. And it wasn't about shouting louder or anything flashy. It was about doing the hard work of demonstrating the value that the public health practitioners bring to their communities and to the population, and the ways that we could potentially do that better and on a broader scale, because none of them wanted anyone to have to go through what they had done, what they had to bear witness and had to endure during that shooting. And so I do think, these are some of the most committed and compassionate individuals that anyone would have the pleasure to work with. And they remained so, even though they had first-person experience, again, with 200 bullets hitting our flagship campus.
So the shooting happened on August 8th. Mm-hmm. And just 9 days into your tenure.
Yeah.
And 20 days later, you were out of a job. In Senate hearings that I listened to, you spoke eloquently and passionately about refusing to rubber stamp vaccine policy changes or to fire experts and replace them with political loyalists. In essence, you stood up for truth and science. You know, when I think about what you did, I'm reminded of my medical school graduation when the commencement speaker told us, new medical school graduates, develop a value system. Decide what it is you're willing to put up with and what it is you're willing to fight for. So, can you speak a bit about the values that guided you through that crisis?
Yeah. I was very fortunate in the way that I not only was brought up, but then being in the scientific community for as long as I had been in. I was brought up, by my parents where, honor, truth, integrity, they were overriding factors just in everything that we did, with my brothers and my sister and I and my family that is how you comported yourself. Every day in every way, and being the daughter of a farmer, then a police officer, and a librarian who happened to also double as a philosopher and a poet. That was just the core and the essence of who I am. I think part of it is I've never sought superficial or materialistic gain. It's just not who I am. And I think because I'm clear of that motivation, my motivation for taking this position in the first place was to continue public service. That's all I've wanted to do, and that was all I was planning on doing. And then the next layer onto that is being in the scientific community. I was very fortunate in the labs that I did research in, both at the University of Wisconsin and then at Stanford. Scientific integrity was everything, and that you didn't publish something unless you were confident that you had checked all of the right boxes, the right controls, to make sure that when you published something, you could stand behind it scientifically with the evidence, because your goal was to further science, was to further, and in my case, the development of diagnostics and vaccines and therapeutics. And you can't do that if you cannot rely upon the evidence that's going into the justification of your work. And so it just never even crossed my mind to compromise on science or health or any type of integrity. One, because I took the position only for one of service, not because there was a materialistic gain on the back end. And then, which can be a motivating factor for why somebody might compromise or may not stand up to that level of pressure to maintain some level of integrity. And two, because it's the right thing to do. Now, as you pointed out, science and evidence change. And it's not that I had a lockdown mental model of we've done it this way in the past, we will always do it this way, and we can never go back and do things that are advancing science in any way. That is not how you innovate. That's not how you create new discoveries. You're questioning and challenging and making sure that you're always progressing in the development of science and evidence to make sure you're continuing to meet the needs in the health sector. That is certainly what we would always want to do and what we would seeking. But to preordain and to compromise any type of approval process for any decision making, absence the evidence and the science associated with it, again, it's anathema to just who I am and everything that I've stood for. And so, that's how we arrived at that inflection point in my career. And I've been asked, would you do it again? And of course I would. Like, there's no other. I launched a Substack recently, and It's called The Road Best Traveled, and it's about the guiding what is the two roads to
Two roads diverge
in Yellow Woods, and sorry, I cannot travel both.
Robert
Be
Frost.
one traveler, Robert Frost. Yes. So again, my mother was a poet. She would often read these poets to us, and yeah, the road. We all have choices, and we all have decision points that we have to make, and there are, when you make a decision, you take a fork in that road, and I will always seek to the road best traveled, and in this particular case, coming back to that decision inflection point, I will always take the inflection point and maintaining that level of scientific and personal integrity.
So the decision was that you were being asked to preemptively approve vaccine policy changes by a committee that had been disbanded by the head of HHS and replaced by, I think, what could generously be called vaccine skeptics. And you weren't going to have any of that. Is that a fair interpretation of what happened?
Yeah, I wasn't going to preordain or pre-approve anything. As a scientist and as somebody who had held various senior positions across very, public and visible organizations, credibility and integrity were overriding factors. And again, if somebody comes to me with scientific evidence and being able to credibly say, this particular thing means we change this particular recommendation, always open to it, always open to being, to learning that there is a better way to do certain things. But to commit to approval regardless of the scientific evidence or underlying evidence. Yeah, it just wasn't something that I could have possibly done, and
and you don't want to say that's unusual, but it is. Today,
I hope it's unusual. Yeah.
Today.
Well, sorry. To continue with your thought. Sorry about that. Yes. Yeah.
You're very nice, and I think you're being very nice, but I don't have any restrictions, and I can say that you stood up with integrity in a way that so many others in this administration have refused to do, who have cravenly followed orders without standing up for expertise in what's right. And to me, that is so incredibly commendable, that you gave up your job for integrity.
Thank you.
So we don't have a lot more time, but I do want to just ask your thoughts about the erosion of trust. Recent polls have shown a declining confidence in doctors, scientists, and really the healthcare system in general. And I think it's not just about people, but it's a loss of confidence in the expertise that those people, healthcare providers, represent. During the pandemic, it was really more from the right, and now with some of the things that we've talked about, it's really coming from the left with really the brazen politicization of science in this government. So whatever the cause, what do you think we can do to rebuild the trust in science?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to first start by saying I'm very worried about where we are. I'm very, very worried about where we are when the sort of medical establishment that has long been committed to trying to improve the health care of individuals who seek its care, whether it's from prevention or in treatment. When patients are openly skeptical to seeing their clinician, someone like you, and you have decades of experience and expertise and having a conversation with a patient saying, here's the best course of action that we can give you to save your life. And they have heard in their communities or online in some social media posting that what you're telling them is not an accurate reflection of what they've heard in these other areas. That must be so challenging, and I'll let you fill in your experiences there. But if that is being replicated in homes and communities and clinical care settings all across this country, and that worries me when people will stop getting the care that they need to keep themselves healthy, to help their children stay healthy, to help their parents stay healthy. That is really worrisome. And the scale and the speed of inaccurate information is so profound and so permeating that I worry very, very much about the gains that we've made in health and WellSpan. We will start to see those eroded because people will be reluctant to get the right treatments or the right preventive measures that will keep them healthier. I think that this will be the challenge of the next decade or more in public health and even in healthcare more broadly, because it will become more and more challenging to be able to provide wisdom in the noise. The noise is so easy, and it's easy to blame or to be skeptical of something when you don't understand what's going on in your health, in your wellness, or those of your loved ones. It's harder to trust an individual, a single source of information, if it doesn't comport to a different narrative that you've been hearing. How do we actually overcome those challenges? That is going to take such extraordinary changes at all levels. It's going to take changes at the highest levels of the federal government. It's going to take changes at state government. It's going to take changes in the technology sector. It's going to take changes in the broader way that individuals get and receive information across social media and other channels. It is going to become harder and harder and harder to be able to discern truth from misinformation and make the best choices available. I do not have an answer for that. And that, for me, is worrisome. How do you overcome those challenges? And how do you make it sustainable? How do you scale that? How do you make sure that people aren't harmed in the process of promulgation of inaccurate information? I don't have an answer for that. I hope that places like University of Chicago with incredible academic depth and the talented student body and other places across the country can really lean into this and think about how do we overcome these extraordinary challenges? What do we do about it? And there is an extraordinary sense of urgency. We can't wait another 10 years to try to figure this out. We need to start figuring this out in the next year and 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, as you point out, there are many layers, protective layers of expertise. You know, there's the federal agencies, there's state-level agencies, there are local hospitals, and then there's the physician
Patient
talking to their,
that's
their,
right.
their patient. But it's just astounding that we've come to a point where the American Association for Pediatrics is directly contradicting vaccine recommendations by the CDC. It's amazing that we've gotten to this point. Anyway, I think we'll open this up to the audience. We'll take some questions. Please keep them concise and respectful.
Hello, my name's Frances. I'm a second year at Booth, so it's very exciting to be able to ask you any questions. It's so cool. Thank you for being here. So my question is, earlier during your intro, you mentioned how there's an interest or appetite for innovation in federal health at the federal level, and I typically think of that as something that's associated with smaller, more nimble organizations. But my question is, what types of innovation are you excited about for public health right now? And also, how can you effectuate those change in such behemoth institutions like CDC?
Yeah, so I think there are many ways that you can think about innovation in public health. I mean, we just talked about one is restoring public trust in public health and communications. We clearly need innovation there. We need innovation on policy, on how we communicate, what mechanisms, what tools, sustainability, scalability. So there's lots of room for innovation there. We also need innovation on how we think about collecting the data to really understand what's happening on the ground in public health at the community level, at the individual level, and how does that ultimately drive decision making to, if in the case of a pandemic or an emerging public health threat, how do you make sure that you're making the best choices to keep people safe? How do you make them quickly? How do you create new tools and technologies to mitigate emergent public health risk? How do we make next generations diagnostics, vaccines, therapeutics, all of that? There's great space for innovation. There's also anticipatory decision making to augment any type of intellectual or scientific capacity that's necessary to be able to further either it's a prevention or response to an emergent public health threat. We're seeing a lot of new tools and decision support capabilities that are being developed. There's so many different ways to think about innovation, from policy, from workforce, from tools and technologies. And what I love about the era that we're living in is that the innovation is coming from so many different places, whether it's Silicon Valley or the East Coast or here in the Midwest. There are no end of opportunities to be able to do things better, to contribute, better decision making and better sort of downstream public health interventions and clinical care. And it is such an exciting time on the innovation forefront, and hopefully some of that will be able to be incorporated into a lot of what the states are taking on and how they're supporting their populations. So there's so much to be done on the public health innovation space. It still makes me excited. It still keeps me energized, and I know that there will be a lot that's done over the next next several years and decades to come.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Akshay Kirthi. I'm a third year in the college majoring in biology. Looking back retrospectively, do you think that the mass censorship that took place on social media platforms regarding people's COVID opinions, many of which have turned out to become true today because science changes, was a net negative towards public trust in science agencies?
It's a really good question. So, really sort of unpacking that, the censorship, I think, we really need to be careful about how we think about, such a broad word, is trying to make sure that there's a balance between information that is helpful and beneficial to the public as they're understanding what's happening. In this particular case, it was COVID. It could be, some other emergent infectious disease, and allowing people to be able to express themselves, as they see appropriate and necessary. There's always going to be sort of a striking balance between the two of those. It's where we have to think about, making sure that the science and the evidence that is supported by technical rigor and in the sort of scientific domains being developed there, it has a platform, but also allowing people to be able to express their questions and concerns, to be able to understand in a productive way, hopefully, what's happening around them. And that is the balance that we have to think about. And hopefully going forward, and I've said this multiple times in a public setting, it's not a matter of if, it is a matter of when we have another emergent event like COVID. We see them, with episodic nature every 2 to 3 years, there'll be something that emerges. And I think it's a very good question, is what do we do going forward to balance the communications of what we understand from a scientific and a technical standpoint, and still allowing people to express themselves or to question. And I don't know that we've hit the right balance yet, but it's certainly something that needs to be considered before we have the next event.
Yeah, I think it's fair. It's a very fair question. And, there was probably some overreach during the pandemic with school closures and certain mandates for vaccines in certain populations. And I think that, no question, contributed to the distrust from many folks, especially on the right, toward the CDC.
Hello, Dr. Monarez. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. My name is Sophia. I'm a third year in the college, and I'm studying economics and philosophy. And I was hoping to ask you about the increased intertwining of economic elites / economic players such as private equity, big pharma, other investor groups, insurance agencies in the government, especially in the form of lobbying efforts and donations. In your view or in your experience, how did that affect public health policy or the CDC? And how do you envision protecting the integrity of policymaking and science in this highly financialized world?
We are seeing a lot of wealth that has been built up, whether it's in the pharmaceutical industries or the big technology industries. I will say that, when the short period of time that I was at the CDC, that did not have any particular influence on at least me in that leadership position. It is something we always have to think about, is, who is in a position of influence. That's not new to this administration. There's always been, influence coming from, individuals, whether, they're through lobbyists or through other means of, taking resources and putting them into a sort of space that can potentially influence the public decision making. It's a really important area to be aware of and to be thoughtful about. And you're a student and you're studying this. What I would always do, and what I do now in my own capacity, is when you're seeing an evolution in legislation or you're seeing an evolution in policy making, being able to try to think about who benefits from that change. And to think through, is it going to be a win or a benefit to a corporation, a larger entity, somebody who's going to be a downstream beneficiary of that? And if that's the case, that's something to be thoughtful about, something to be wary of. Or is it actually going to be of greater benefit to the American people? And I am concerned, and it's sort of independent of that, I am concerned about what's happening to hardworking Americans when it comes to the provision of health care. What we're seeing in terms of Medicaid, what we're seeing in terms of the ACA, or what we're seeing in terms of just the cost of private health insurance. The cost is doubling relative to the wage increases. I am worried about what that means overall to healthcare and the accessibility of quality healthcare to so many Americans, that I do think that that's going to become a very significant challenge here. We've already known that access to high quality healthcare for many Americans who are in lower and middle incomes has been a challenge, and knowing whether or not that we're going to see an extension or an expansion of the inability to be able to get access to high quality, timely healthcare. I don't know, what are you seeing?
No, I mean, having thought about these issues for a very long time, writing books about it. I think that, what we see in healthcare today is just increasing consolidation and monopolization. We see it in insurers, we see it in providers. Everyone wants to consolidate and get more power. And that has led to a focus on money and profit in healthcare. And we talk about the erosion of trust. That undoubtedly contributes to the erosion of public trust in doctors and medicine, when they see how the system is organized to maximize profit. I don't necessarily know what to do about it. If I did, I would be talking to the King of Sweden. But no, it's incredible, and you make a very good point. We are running out of time, so I'm going to take one more question for Dr. Monarez.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Monarez, for being here with us tonight. I'm so short. My name is Zena. I'm a fourth year majoring in political science and public policy with a health policy specialization. And I just wanted to ask you, with everything that's been said this evening, as a non-science expert, what can I do besides just telling my family members and friends, to trust medicine and to trust the experts? What work can I do career-wise, or just on a larger level of changing and restoring trust in CDC and public health?
I love that question. The first thing I would say is don't trust for its own sake. When you are faced with an issue that you want to better understand so you can be an advocate, so that you can champion some particular issue for your family, learn about it, ask the right questions, get some confidence yourself, so that when you are an ambassador of trust, it's coming from a position of knowledge and strength. Don't just trust for its own sake. That's part of the challenge that we're having, is that it's who do you trust and why do you trust them? And making sure that you have the confidence to trust what it is that you're promulgating. It becomes sort of a way that you can be sort of the ember of restoring trust in the circles in your families and cascading outwards. So that's what I would say. And then sort of on a broader, career trajectory, is it takes more than just scientists to be ambassadors of trust. It takes policymakers, it takes political scientists, it takes people who are going to invest in all their time and energy in all different sectors to be able to surround science and say, this is why we need to hold scientists and medical practitioners to the highest highest standards. And when we do, that is when we can trust them, and then we can make sure that we are communicating with those around us to be able to have to sort of promulgate outwards restoration and public trust. So thank you for the question.
Susan, it was such a pleasure meeting you, being on the stage with you. Like I said, I really think that you are a hero in many ways. I want to thank you for your insights, your service, and most of all, for standing up for science and public health. These are very difficult, but also pivotal times for public health and medicine, and people like you and conversations like this are needed to rebuild trust. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us tonight.